So this last module is going to be the least technical of all the different modules that we've done. And it'll also probably be the shortest. I'm going to put a couple readings on Blackboard. And even this video, I intend to be relatively short. I think corporate governance is an issue that gets covered in a lot of different classes and probably in a lot more detail. I don't mean for this module to be the be-all, end-all of corporate governance, how it works, the inner details of it, but instead just sort of at the conclusion of all the different modules and all the different topics that we've talked about, how corporate governance fits into this. And I think it fits here really well because the last module being risk and uncertainty and talking about how people make decisions and risk aversion and those sorts of things. Corporate governance dovetails really well with that, I think. So going to just give you a little bit of context in this video so that when you go through the readings, you sort of have a sense of how it ties into the different topics that we've talked about. There's many definitions of corporate governance. My personal preference is probably the broadest one. So I'm going to define corporate governance as the mechanisms, rules, practices, processes, and relations by which corporations are controlled and directed. And I like that one because it is so broad, and I think of corporate governance as a very broad issue. Now, if you were to Google what makes good corporate governance, you will come up with a seemingly endless number of lists that have important corporate governance features, and there will be some commonality between them, but they all kind of differ a little bit. There's no one accepted, this is what makes good corporate governance. But what I want to do is I want to try and reflect on some of the stuff we've talked about in this course and then come back to this question and say, okay, from the perspective of the things we've talked about, what are some components that would make good corporate governance? I don't pretend to give you a list or say that there's a list out there that is complete. I don't present this in a way that, this is all you need for good corporate governance, but rather in the framework of what we've talked about, in the topics that we've examined, what would make good corporate governance in regards to those things. So let me start with two different questions and then sort of start working our way back to that, what makes good corporate governance. So the first question, why is corporate governance important? There are all kinds of issues, and it seems more every day, that corporations are dealing with. They're dealing with, and this will start to, excuse me, start to bleed into the second question of who a corporation is responsible to. But government regulation, government scrutiny of what businesses are doing, whether it's environmental concerns, labor concerns, regulatory concerns, safety concerns, all these different things. The firm, as time has progressed, has become less sort of operating on their own and more part of an interconnected system, so the economy overall. And having good corporate governance means that you're going to recognize all of those, not just, so again, I'm blurring these two questions here, not just your shareholders and owners, but your stakeholders, which your stakeholders can be customers, it could be societies you operate in, it could be the environment. That you can have stakeholders could be much broader. And if you have lax corporate governance, you tend to focus on one thing and one thing only. Stereotypically, that's profits at the expense of other things. And what we've seen over time is that then opens up liabilities that you have because we no longer expect our firms to just maximize profits. We expect them to behave ethically, to maximize profits in a sustainable manner, to treat people well, whether we're talking customers, the society they operate in, their workers, all of those different things. So all of these questions are a little bit rhetorical in that there's tons and tons and tons of answers. And if you were to Google corporate sustainability, who's a corporation responsible to, I have no doubt you're going to find tons of different answers. All I'm trying to do is just, okay, look, a lot of the topics that we've looked at are focused on sort of firm behavior, but it's not hard to change the payoff. So if you go back and you think of pricing policies or collusion or any of those different things, it's not hard in any of the stuff that we've done to imagine that the payoffs, the profits that we've used and calculated for game theory, for all of these different things, could be brought into being their payoff, incorporating how they treat others and those sorts of things. It would not be hard to incorporate any of those. So it's not sheerly profits that we've been talking about. Okay, now, relevant to those two questions is something called the principal agent problem. And my guess is, particularly in a management class, maybe in a finance class, you encounter this. So the principal agent problem is when the principal creates an environment in which an agent's incentives don't align with those of the principal. So stereotypically, you think of workers, they're trying to make a living and they're trying to minimize the amount of work they put in. So if I set up a system where my workers can collect their paycheck and they don't have to do anything, they're going to tend to try and default to those things. So oftentimes what we think about is we think of taking our compensation system, and this is where you'll start to see some tiebacks to when we were talking about risk in the previous module. We usually try and take our compensation system and try and align the incentives of the agent, which in a firm's perspective is oftentimes the workers. But when we're talking corporate governance, this might be thinking about a board of directors and the CEO and the management team running the day-to-day operations. The CEO and the management team, they have their incentives, and the board of directors is charged with sort of overseeing the overall direction of the company. But it could be at any level within the company. It could be, the janitorial staff who wants to nap overnight when they're supposed to be cleaning, and the incentives that we set up for them. So this principal agent problem is very problematic, and a lot of our compensation systems have been designed to address this. So for example, in certain industries, workers are paid based on their output. So they would call that a piece rate system, where for every unit of output they produce, they get paid so much money. And the idea there is you're incentivizing your workers to churn out as much output as possible. You offer stock options and stock bonuses to your upper management so that they're trying to maximize shareholder return. Not necessarily stakeholder return, but shareholder return. Most of our compensation systems have been designed really to try and deal with this principal agent problem. But then that brings us back to where we started, which is what makes for good corporate governance. Okay, so sort of that overarching question. Now, again, you can find all kinds of lists of what makes good corporate governance out there. But with the perspective of what I've said in the last couple slides, and in particular thinking about that principal agent problem, good corporate governance, you have to be aware of all of the incentives that you're setting forth, whether intended or unintended. So do you incentivize your workers to take on more risk than what you should because you think, well, if I give them these massive bonuses or if I dangle these massive bonuses out there, then they're actually going to be incentivized to try and maximize my profits. And even if you do try and maximize profits, you have to worry about sort of all these other activities and how, like thinking of collusion, do they, go across a ethical, moral, legal boundary in search of those profits. So things in terms of the topics we've talked about, things that are going to be important in terms of corporate governance. Again, this is not a massive list. It's not intended to be. Transparency. So explaining to your stakeholders, not just your shareholders, how you're operating, how you're behaving, how you're making decisions, how you're viewing your responsibilities to different groups. The more transparent, the easier it is to get those incentives lined up, because it's not going to be something where I'm going to risk colluding if everything is going to be really transparent. So any policies that improve transparency are going to improve the outcomes that the firm ends up with, and are going to result in good corporate governance. Independence of board of directors. So there are often times when, if you look at boards of different companies, there's a lot of incest, where you've got executives from other companies serving on each other's boards. And then you run into some of these issues where, okay, we're going to give them extra compensation because they're on my board, and then they'll turn around and they'll give me excess compensation. So how independent the board of directors is, how much control they have over things, those are going to be important issues to think through in terms of making good decisions. And then responsibility to all stakeholders. Now, sometimes the focus here ends up on shareholders, and there's recognition that large shareholders tend to have a larger say in terms of what the company does, and it's not that that's necessarily bad, but if the lower shareholder amounts are just simply ignored and have no voice in the process, that can potentially be problematic. And when we use the word stakeholders instead of shareholders, we're also talking about like any responsibilities we have to our local community, those sorts of things. And the more recognition there is there, and the more that aligns to the way that the company is directed, the better. So we're seeing a lot of growth in the area of corporate social reporting and recognition of, okay, what are companies doing on labor policy? What are they doing on outsourcing? What are they doing on environmental policy? And the more that those things get built in as metrics that are outcomes for the company, the better off the company is going to end up being, because the pay and the compensation and the incentives are no longer just linked to profitability, but they're linked to the overall, what is the business doing, which incorporates all of these external groups, and it's a more well-rounded picture of what the company is doing, which then allows the directors to know that I don't need to just focus on profits. Now, I'm not bad talking profits. Profits are necessary. But if there's recognition in terms of compensation, incentives, those sorts of things for doing the right thing, not just making money, then you're going to get a lot more of a sustainable, in the most broad sense, organization moving forward. In the rest of this module, I'm just going to give you some different readings on different companies and how they make decisions, good or bad, in terms of corporate governance, and then also how corporate governance relates to profits and those sorts of things. But this last module is intended to be a little shorter and a little less technical, as I know you guys are wrapping up all the deliverables that are due at the end of the term.